So I want to welcome everybody. This is the second installment of the spring 2023 edition of the Behavioral Science Author Series. Thanks for being with us on a Friday evening, or maybe some other time, depending on where you're joining us in the world or on YouTube. The series is a collaboration between Zeitgeist Media and Behavior Change for Good. And so I want to thank Katie Milkman and Angela Duckworth for launching the series, for BCFG's Alex Lucier and Dina Gromet for their help behind the scenes, and as well as Zeitgeist Media's Isabel Heck and Cassie Brava, who's helping us today. You'll see some links in the chat, including to the BCFG website and YouTube page, where you can see old versions of the older talks and newsletters for BCFG as well as Zeitgeist. So I'll be chatting with our guest, Geoff Cohen, for about 20 minutes. Then we've saved time at the end, about 10 or 15 minutes for Q&A. So you can enter your questions into the Q&A, and you can also upvote the questions that you'd like to see answered. I'm delighted to have Geoff Cohen joining us this evening. Geoff is a professor of psychology at Stanford. He also kindly let me sit in on his lab meetings back when I was an undergrad, which was almost in a different century. I decided, given that everybody's on this smart AI these days, I asked ChatGPT about him, and this is what ChatGPT had to say. It says he's widely recognized for his groundbreaking research on social influence, self-affirmation theory, and the role of identity in shaping individual behavior. Cohen's work has shed light on how our social surroundings, personal beliefs, and biases influence our decisions and actions. Pretty accurate, right? Not bad. We're, welcome to our brave new world. Geoff is also the author of the book Belonging, the science of creating connection and bridging divides, which we'll be talking about today. It tackles the foundational problem of belonging, and why it matters and how we can create a sense of belonging. The approach that he takes is grounded in classic social psychology. Right? The greatest compliment you can give a psychologist is that you're a Lewinian, like a true Lewinian, and Geoff and his book are absolutely that. Kurt Lewin, which makes you a Lewinian if you follow his work, fled Nazi Germany in the years prior to World War II. And one of Lewin's central insights is that people's behavior is not just a function of what's inside their heads, but also the situation that they're in and how they interpret and try to navigate that situation. So that's where we're going to start our conversation today. But I wanted to first welcome Geoff. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Dave. It's really good to be with you after all these centuries.
Yes, at least two. So tell me a little bit more about Lewin. He was fleeing Nazi Germany. How did that influence his thinking about how a democratic society could behave in this profoundly evil way, and the role that belonging plays in that process?
Lewin's insight was that the fault for many of these sort of human social problems lay neither in our stars nor in ourselves, but in the situations that people create. And so he's very interested in understanding the rise of Nazism and the horrors of World War II, not in terms of sort of any innate cultural characteristic of the Germans, but in terms of the intricate system of situational influences ranging from propaganda to youth groups that Hitler and his henchmen had created. Now, when he came to America, he launched this field that we now call social psychology, and his brazen idea was that science could be used to improve social conditions. And unlike the other social sciences, which simply described and observed human behavior and situations, Lewin had this bold idea that we, scientists, could create situations anew of our own, and thereby create new realities. And that was his brazen idea that's still with us today, that we can create new situations and thereby unlock new potentials.
So one of the first pieces of research that he did that you talk about in the book is exactly on this topic, right? About how changes in the leadership style in a group can change how people think of that group and how they behave towards each other. And that resonated strongly with the idea of belonging. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Oh, I love that research. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Lewin would create these, what he called cultural oases. So his idea was that, yeah, as bad as the wider culture can get, we can kind of create situations, oases. That's why I kind of have the metaphor of the umbrella. As bad as the wider culture gets, we can create situations that create new realities and new relations for people. And so in the study you described, to make a long story short, what he did was to go into boys' clubs. These were sort of clubs, artistic clubs, and he trained the leader, the adult leader of the clubs, to act in either a democratic way, helping the kids to identify their individual wills, creating an inclusive climate so that all children felt like their views were represented and integrated into the larger whole. Or for other groups, the adult leader took an authoritarian approach, sort of command and control, telling the kids what to do and sort of bossing them around. Now, the big story is the impact of the leader on the climate of the group. When the leader acted in a democratic way, scapegoating and aggression went way, way down. And the kids even seemed to sort of relate to one another in a totally different way. They would see each other almost as sort of sources of pleasure and affirmation. And it was fun to cooperate. Their orientation was on the task rather than on their own ego. By contrast with the authoritarian leaders, the kids became like animals, like either really, really docile and passive or really, really aggressive and scapegoating of one another. You would walk into these groups and you think these are totally different kids. No, what had happened was that the leader, through his actions, had shaped the interpersonal relations among the kids and thereby sort of changed the nature of the kids as it manifests in the situation. That was a powerful demonstration of how a leader can change the situation and thus change the way people behave and interact for better or for worse. And that was Lewin's style. He would kind of give us little glimpses of social paradise, right? You could kind of pull the curtain back and say, here's what we're capable of under better circumstances. Even when the wider culture might be harsh and malevolent, we can create these little situational oases where people feel included and they feel like they belong and they feel like their voice is represented. And that to me is the enduring message of Lewin, the power of situations to create belonging and unlock our personal and collective potential.
Right. And so this idea that there's a feeling of belonging that you have that's internal, right? You feel whether that you belong or you don't, but whether or not you have that feeling can be strongly situational. Is that
I think
right?
we all feel this. I mean, I know I do. There can be times when we're out and about and all of a sudden someone smirks or frowns or makes a kind of insinuating comment and we feel, there's something. I don't feel there's a sort of, as this sociologist once put it, there's like a negative social self, like lurking about in the air between us. And I think situations can do that. And it could happen in any encounter, it can happen in school, the workplace. Our sense of belonging is created in situations. I use the term belonging for the book. Belonging can either be a noun or a verb, right? Belonging is a state. I feel connected to this group or this situation or these people, right? It's a sense of connection, but it's also a verb. Belonging is a process through which I am navigating situations to figure out, is this a place for me? Can I find belonging? Can I create it? Can I have a sense of home here? And belonging uncertainty is a term that Greg Walton and I came up with to just refer to a process through which we are kind of navigating our belonging, trying to resolve the uncertainty that we often feel in situations, especially work, but just given the ambiguity of social life in so many spheres and corners of social life that we experience.
Right. And so that's what I wanted to sort of build on a little bit, that sort of sense of ambiguity, because situations are not objective, right? We have to interpret them, and not everybody interprets them the same way.
Yeah.
Right. So I might feel like I'm being nice and inclusive, but you might be picking up signals that you're an outsider. And so in the book, you really talk about this process of helping to craft these situations where people can feel belong. And it starts with this process of empathy. And in particular, I wanted you to talk a little bit about empathy and in particular listening, and how the certainty that we might feel about how we interpret a situation isn't necessarily how everybody else sees a situation or is experiencing it.
I mean, if there's one lesson of a lot of social psychology research over the past few decades, it's the power of perception. Power of perception. situations aren't just out there in front of our eyes, as sort of Lewin was very interested in understanding, but they unfold behind our eyes. We make sense of them. We make sense of them. We construct them using our mental filters. And to some degree, we're all in the same situation right now. We're in this chat room or this chat. But in another way, this situation is a different situation for each person here. Everyone here is applying a different mental filter, different set of expectations for understanding and experiencing what is happening here. And so that is a kind of core lesson of social psychology, is that the situation as you experience it may be very, very different from the situation that someone else, as the situation someone else experiences. What can feel comfortable for me might be threatening for you. What can feel like a home for me might feel alienating for you. And that is easy to say, harder to understand, and even harder to live by, that wisdom. And so perhaps the best example of this empathy comes from research, and the importance of perception comes from research from my own mentor, Claude Steele, and his research on stereotype threat, which I imagine a lot of you are all familiar with. But to kind of reframe the work a little bit, I think what that work shows is that something as routine as the standardized test in school is actually experienced very, very differently as a function of whether you're stereotyped or not. If I'm a Black kid taking an IQ test or a standardized test, I experience it as much more psychologically dire on average, because it is an arena where I know if I do poorly, it could confirm this negative stereotype that's out there lurking about me and my group. And so that makes the situation of the standardized test, though objective on the surface, very different for different people, and a much more exclusionary and unfair and unequal playing field for members of negatively stereotyped groups. And that's just one example of many. And what I think a lot of situation bending or crafting is, like this idea of situation crafting, how can we change situations to promote inclusion, isn't just changing the material and physical aspects of the situations we're in, but helping people to experience or perceive them in more inclusive and welcoming ways.
Yeah. And so if somebody is interpreting something in a different way, if somebody's had different experiences in the past that make them skeptical or come in with some reservations, they can be experiencing that situation as much more threatening than you might think it is. And so you talk about listening as a way of recognizing, right, the humility that it takes to not just be like, look, I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm trying, you're welcome here. And so get over your concerns. Instead, you sort of describe this process of taking seriously another person's point of view, or even as my colleague here, Nick Epley, talks about it, sort of perspective getting.
I love that term, perspective getting. We need much more of that. It's a kind of strategy for empathy. We want to empathize. Well, one of the best ways to do it is to ask questions and listen to the answers. And just by the way, I include research as perspective getting. When Greg and I did our research on belonging uncertainty, the so-called interventions or practices that we developed came out of, I think, a lot of perspective getting. That was the research we did. And from that research, we found something really interesting, which was that for Black kids, in contrast to the predominant understanding of their underperformance, they didn't doubt their abilities. They weren't low in self-esteem. They didn't wonder if they had the ability to do well in school. Their concern was more about their belongingness. They didn't know whether or not they would be accorded a full measure of respect or regard from others. And it was a kind of a question, as we put it, a question of belonging, not ability, that was on their mind. And that came out of 5 years of research, that understanding of the phenomenology of being a student of color on campus. Based on that, then we were in a better position to support them and empower them by creating this practice. I prefer the term practice, in which we gave students information that conveyed to them, these were freshman students of color, that if you're feeling doubts about belonging and not being included, that's normal. And with a few strategies, a few sort of habits, you're likely to get through it and find your niche here. And we convey that information in the form of what we call an intervention. I actually like the term practice better. And we found that that was very effective at reassuring them that they could belong, and they felt a higher sense of belonging, showed better mental health, better physical health over the course of those 4 years. And even that little brief practice, even though it was just an hour of sharing stories to reassure them of their belonging, closed the achievement gap by 50%. And years later, they were more satisfied in their careers, as work by Shannon Brady has later found. So this is perspective getting puts you in a better position to support and empower other people. And I think it's an invaluable tool.
Yeah, because without doing that perspective getting, without doing that listening, you have to sort of use only your own intuitions in terms of what, and those could easily be misguided. So that brings us this quote I think that you use of Lewin's is to show that you understand a situation. The best way to understand a situation is to change it, right? And so that's sort of what you've done in this practice you described. You cite the work of, he's not a social psychologist, he's a sociologist, but Erving Goffman, and the term that he adopted of being wise. And so this connects for me to this idea of listening and understanding what the actual issues and experiences people have are. Can you tell us a little bit more of what it means to be wise and how you use that to think about the interventions that
Yeah. It has both a general and specific meaning. The general meaning that Greg Walton uses is to refer to practices that are wise to a person's psychology, wise to the person's perception, what's going on behind the eyes, perhaps knowledge acquired through perspective getting. That's one meaning of the word wise. A second meaning of the word wise is related, but more specific, which is to refer to individuals or practices that convey to the other person that they are seen with dignity and as fully belonging. So, of course, the two definitions go hand in hand. If I'm wise to the concerns that are on your mind, the questions, the insecurities, the insensitivities, for instance, I'm in a better position to disabuse you of those and to kind of create a situation where you do feel like you're viewed as belonging. That was the term, that definition of belonging, or that definition of wise, what Erving Goffman, the sociologist, he injected that term into the scholarship, but he borrowed it from the gay subculture of the 1950s. And but it basically means, I see you, I believe in you, and I'm here for you. That's the message conveyed. And the social belonging practice that I just described does that. There's several examples of what we might call wise practices or wise interventions.
I wanted to ask you about one of them in particular, actually.
Okay, great.
There's a study of yours that I love that's done with Claude Steele and Lee Ross, if I'm not mistaken, about delivering feedback across the racial divide, with a white professor giving feedback to white students, to Black students, and how that's interpreted differently, what concerns they bring, and how you overcome that potential mistrust.
Yes. And that was also with Valpurdy Greenaway and David Jaeger. We did a few studies, but here's one where teachers, these are middle school teachers, 7th grade teachers, gave their kids, students of color, critical feedback on an essay that they wrote. And for one group, the kids just got the normal feedback that they would get, that the teacher would give to the kids, just critical feedback on how to do better, along with any encouragement that the teachers wanted to provide. For another group of kids, the teacher penned a little note that they appended to the criticism. And that note stated this: I'm giving you this critical feedback because I have high expectations and I believe in your potential to reach them. And that was it. So there were two groups. What we found is that students in that second group were much more motivated to revise their essay. Whereas only 17% revised their essay in the control group that just got the criticism, the percentage of students who revised their essay when they got that note was 71%.
Yeah,
look at that. That's just like one sentence that kind of unlocks the kids' motivation, ability to learn from the feedback. And then years and years later, we found these kids who got that note were even more likely to make it into college. They were more likely to make it into college. Now, of course, that kind of effect doesn't happen everywhere. It's about the timeliness of the message. When a kid is in 7th grade, that is an embryonic formative period. And if I get that message, especially if I'm a member of a marginalized group, that I believe in you, that can be like water on parched soil. It's a wise message right at the time I need it. It's the message that I belong and I can succeed right at this moment where that question is salient on my mind. And that's a real good example of wise practices. They're practices that speak to the psychological concerns people have about belonging at key moments. And there's many, many others.
So I want to remind everybody that we're going to start the Q&A session in just a few minutes here. So if you have questions, please put them into the Q&A. So you foreshadowed a little bit of what I was going to ask in a moment, but let's skip ahead to it about this trajectory. Some of these effects are sort of amazingly large. So not only were you more likely to revise your essay, but it had these downstream consequences. So you've answered, yeah, you've given me part of this answer already. So maybe, well, let me shift gears slightly then. Can you tell me a little bit more about, you mentioned right now in your answer that in this very small deflection of getting this little note, it changes the situation, it changes your interpretation of what's going on here. But one of the way you phrased it is that you sort of removed a barrier, the concern that people had. And that again is a very Lewinian way of approaching things, right? The person is the same, the underlying motivations are the same, but there was something that stood in their way that may not stand in other people's way, but because I have this concern that how can I trust this person and the feedback they're giving me and how they're going to treat me? Are they going to treat me fairly? That when you remove that concern, you allow that person's full self to come through. I wanted to give you a chance to sort of talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, it's really well put. One way to put it is that people are complex. They have motivational complexities. I think we're overly simple when we read people. We think, oh, they're performing poorly. You know, they failed this test, or they didn't turn in their assignment, or they didn't do a good job at work. They must lack aptitude or grit or willpower or motivation. Where we commit what Lee Ross calls the fundamental attribution error. We make these sort of corresponding dispositional judgments. But I often think, and we know this from our personal experience, that, you know, a lot of times we're in this tension state, right? So those kids, for example, in that study on wise criticism, what's amazing is that they really do want to succeed. They want to do well in school. And research confirms this, like minority kids really value school even more than white kids on average. So there's a kind of reservoir of motivation there. However, there's this kind of competing concern. Can I trust? If I put myself out there, will I get burned or betrayed? And we know that kind of experience. Like one of the worst things is to trust someone and then to be burned. And so I might understandably have a lot of trepidation in these kinds of situations where I know my group, or there's a history of my group being excluded. And what these wise practices do is they kind of just alleviate that psychological break on,
like that umbrella on the cover of the book.
Yeah, they kind of lift it a little bit. Yeah. So then now what's inside can better surface. And I think almost all the so-called interventions are like that in that they activate what's already there. They don't really have any causal power unto themselves. The causal power, they're more like catalysts. They activate the potentials that are already there, but inhibited. And I think we all feel this as a kind of shy or introverted or socially sensitive person. I think people experience this kind of thing all the time, where there is so much in me that I could express, but something is inhibiting it. And this is the sort of tension system view of people that I think social psychology is all about. It's about lifting barriers, lifting restraints, so what's inside can better manifest on the outside.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's one of the things that psychological perspective brings to the table, that if people are underperforming, it's not a matter of adding more motivation and giving them incentives, but recognizing what's there and helping remove the barriers to that coming through.
Absolutely. I mean, and it also, by the way, applies to our political conversations. I think that, we think that all the other side needs is a little more argumentation, a little more evidence. So I'm going to bombard them with that. And that doesn't work. That's not the issue. Right. In a lot of these cases, there's a group influence, a group commitment that is the restraining force. And so much political in resistance to political change.
So I'm going to shift gears now a little bit to go to the audience Q&A. So Theodore Hopp, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, I'm not 100% sure, is asking about the us versus them bias, which you have a whole chapter about. The question is, can we overcome our us and them bias? He asked by the way we frame a conversation and what cannot be overcome in this regard. So that's the
I think
flip side of it. What are the
example.
limits?
It's a great question. Yes, we can. We can do that through a number of different strategies, but one is approaching these conversations across divides. Let's talk about conversations, especially political conversations, which are so important now to have in a more civil way. We can approach them with a genuine attitude of curiosity rather than out of a desire to persuade or convert or proselytize. There's some nice research by Julia Minson that demonstrates that when we think the other person on the other side of a political issue wants to learn rather than convince us, we're actually, ironically, more persuaded by them, or at least think that feel that the conversation goes better. So that attitude of genuine curiosity and a growth mindset about our own potential to learn from one another is really key. And I think that's one way in which we can, in spite of the larger forces that divide us, create, and going back to Lewin, these little oases in our conversations and in our encounters that go a little bit better, that break down this us-them divide. So many things are like this. I'm just going to do one call out with for some of my favorite research in the past decade, David Brookman and Josh.
I was just going to ask about exactly that. Yeah, perfect.
On deep canvassing, which shows basically, not if you ask the question, what works for changing strong political attitudes? The answer for a few decades was pretty much nothing. There's pretty much nothing that works. Shy of putting people in a totally new reference group. But then into the scene arrive Brookman and Kalla, who show that a 10-minute conversation can actually bridge the divide, the political divide. And they show that a brief 10-minute conversation that canvassers have with conservative voters, and I think it was Miami-Dade, Florida, actually increased these voters' support for transgender rights, and a later study, immigration. And not only was the change large, it was lasting. Over the next 6 months, the conservative voters were still supportive of transgender rights, and even more likely to take a stand against hate speech against transgender individuals. They had been transformed by a 10-minute conversation. What were the ingredients of that 10-minute conversation? I'll give just two, but there's a few. One is it was a genuine conversation. The canvassers listened and had a conversation with the voters. They didn't engage in any kind of righteous indignation or condemnation. They just discussed the issue. They turned over the topic, as the word conversation means, is actually to turn over together. I love that. It's like you're turning over an object together, trying to look at it from multiple angles together. That was what happened. That's how the canvassers were instructed to engage. And then the second thing they did was a form of emotion, of perspective giving and perspective getting. They shared stories about their experiences with transgender individuals, and even encouraged the voters to think about the emotional impact of being excluded, what that might be like for them. And the combination of those two things, non-judgmental conversation and perspective giving and sharing stories, was transformative. And I think that's how we beat this polarization process, is by having more civil conversations. And social psychology provides some nice strategies and practices that we can all develop to make those intentions more of a reality in our day-to-day conversations.
Right, and bring it back to belonging specifically. We all have various experiences of belonging less. And so recognizing that that's the experience that the other person is having in a situation that you might be causing in the situation or supporting, casts a different light on the same topic. I love that research.
Nobody likes to feel wrong. Nobody likes to be judged. By the way, it even applies to bringing extremists and terrorists back. Ari Kruglansky has some nice research, a couple of books on this topic. Marshall Rosenberg, who used to who I love, he used to have these sort of difficult conversations across with people who had hateful beliefs. It is all about emotional empathizing. And I love this line from Marshall Rosenberg. He's like, you know what? I've learned over the years not to take too seriously what's in people's heads. Instead, I found life more enjoyable when I listen to what's in people's hearts. And then I find that there's a lot more similarity between us, and a lot more similarity that grows between us when I have that recognition that, it's what's in the heart that matters, and what's in the mind, well, that comes and goes in different ways. But by being attentive to the emotions of the moment, you can really be in a better position to support and empower people and help them feel they belong. And that, as we know, belonging in so many ways is really crucial for people being open, venturesome, interested in growth and learning.
Yeah, and it connects back to sort of philosophy, like reason is the slave to the passions, and the work that Jonathan Haidt does, that our reasoning is often a sort of just a rationalization of the things that we feel. Yeah. And that once we change the way we feel or connect with the way we feel, although that thinking will follow pretty quickly.
I think so. It is in the Brookman and Kala deep canvassing work, I think that's part of what makes it so effective, is that there is a bond between the canvasser and the voter. And I feel a little bit committed to this individual. I feel a connection to this individual. And that's probably part of what creates the enduring effect. It's like a little miniature reference group that then shifts my beliefs in an enduring way. And so the emotion is the sort of bedrock for change there.
Sean Foley asks, for workforce education and talent performance improvement, do you feel that providing metrics by which everyone, as best as possible, is objectively measured might increase collaboration and connectedness? I'm rolling over this answer, this question as I ask it.
Yeah. Well, I think objective metrics are really important in one specific situation: the hiring and promotion process. Work by Eric Ullman and me showed that often what happens when people are making hiring decisions and promotion decisions is that they shift their criteria in ways that favor the people that they want to hire, which is often people from more kind of privileged backgrounds, maybe positively stereotyped groups. So we kind of engage in this kind of retrofitting of criteria. It's like, I really want to hire this person, and therefore I'm going to sort of shift my criteria a bit so that they fit the credentials of this person. If they're people-oriented, I think, yeah, what's really important for this job is being people-oriented. If they're goal-oriented, I think, oh no, what's really important for this job is being goal-oriented. And what we found is that actually establishing clear metrics, objective criteria, before you even peek at the application folders is very effective at reducing discrimination based off of gender and other social class and other group variables. So it promotes fairness. So I think in that way, objective metrics are pretty good when you want to kind of beat down bias, which can kind of peep into or can kind of poison our judgments of others in these really exclusionary ways that undermine people's belonging. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, and they don't need to be, as you're sort of going back to your previous answer, they don't need to be intentional or malicious in any way, right? Reason is the slave of the passions, right? Like when you feel like you want to hire this person, your mind constructs these explanations, and you're not. If I asked you, did you construct that because you wanted to hire this person? You'd say, of course not. I wanted to do it because being goal oriented is obviously important to this task, and so that's exactly why you have to do it in advance.
Which brings us to the best wise intervention of all: humility. I saw this encapsulated in a bumper sticker I once saw, which actually goes back to Taoist wisdom. Don't believe everything you think. I love that. Don't believe it. That's the lesson of implicit bias, or just bias research in general. It's like the thoughts that flow through our head are not necessarily to be trusted. And if you're aware of that, then you're in a better position to sort of fight back. The people who engage in the most discrimination aren't the people who say that they're potentially biased. It's the people who say that they're free of bias, who claim to be objective. Those are people you have to watch out for. Those are people who are not monitoring for bias. However, if you make people a little more humble, like, understand that your positions and points of view are subjective, and of course, some positions are more meritorious than others, but being aware of the possibility of bias, our own potential to do things that are regrettable. And we all are capable of that. Is one of the best antidotes, for exclusion, I think. And it kind of begins with each individual. As I love that quote from Richard Feynman. He's talking about science, who's a physicist. He says, the first principle is do not fool yourself.
Yeah.
Do not fool and you are the easiest to fool. He was talking about science. Same applies to social life.
Yeah. Yeah. And humility is a great way to put that, because it doesn't have to be some kind of radical skepticism of everything you believe. Just a humility to recognize that you could be wrong.
Yeah. I have the potential.
I have one last question for you from Garth Lips. He says, I am interested in using the belongingness and critical feedback interventions with my graduate students in Jamaica. What are the critical elements of these interventions that I need to include to ensure a lasting effect? So I don't know if there's magical ingredients, but what are the kind of basic things not to forget, to keep in mind as you craft these specific to whatever situation that you're in?
I would say that for the social belonging intervention, one thing is very important, which is there's a perspective getting process. You want to make sure that the content of the stories that you're giving to people really reflects the social reality. And so Greg Walton and Dave Yeager and Shannon Brady have this whole, I think they have a really useful manual that should be available on their website, where they just describe this process of, you want to talk to senior people, senior students or senior employees at the company to find out what it was really like, what their struggles were and how they overcame it, so that the stories resonate. So that's one thing I would say, just having a kind of stage of perspective getting to make sure that whatever you're doing, whatever practice you're applying, it's attuned to the specific questions and psychological reality of the people you're trying to help. So that's one. Second is intention matters. Intention matters. The wise criticism note, that message, I believe in you and I think you could reach a high standard, will not work if your students pick up on the message that this is just lip service. You're just saying this, or I know you're just telling me this because that's what you read in that journal. It will not work in that situation. These practices are tools for channeling our attention, making it surface in the moment. And so I would say that an attitude of true belief in your students is really key. Making sure that the message is genuine is really key. If it comes across as lip service, if the kids feel like you just keep saying the same thing over and over again and everyone else is getting the same message, it won't work. And so that's why I think that the best hope here isn't just to use these tools, but to actually awaken in ourselves this high expectations for the people we're with in school and the workplace and our social encounters, believing in their potential. And from that belief comes a whole bunch of unimagined interventions that we could all apply in any situation. I love this work by Jason Okanafua, where he basically, it's not any specific intervention, it's just teaching teachers to be more empathic of their students and to understand that when their kids misbehave, it's not because they're troublemakers, it's often because they feel like they don't belong. So they're kind of counteracting the fundamental attribution error and giving the teachers higher expectations for what the kids are capable of. And he's found in a number of studies, now even just one big replication that came out that that's halves the number of kids who are suspended from school. It actually makes the kids behave better. So I think attitude and intention are really key here. And I think this often gets missed as a science. We don't understand a lot of times that what we're scaling isn't an intervention, but a new psychological reality that we're trying to create for people that we're hoping to support.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's not the letter of the intervention. It won't necessarily replicate even from one classroom to the next if the teacher doesn't have those expectations and doesn't have that empathy.
Absolutely. That's well said. Yeah, absolutely. And that's easy. And it's easy to forget.
So I want to thank you again for being here with us. Thanks for everybody else for being here. I want to remind you that this is the book of Belonging. The link to get it is in the chat. Cassie, you might want to put it in there one more time for anybody who's joining us late. But it's a wonderful read. It's full of stories of other interventions, for instance. that we didn't have time to get to today that I really love, along with a lot else. So thanks, Jeff, so much for being here with us.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Cassie. And thank you, everyone, for making the time on Friday night. I'm always looking for an excuse and an opportunity to spend my Friday talking about social psychology. Sincerely.
I appreciate that very much. Our next, if you're here today, you're already registered for our next session, which is on Friday, March 10th at noon Eastern time with Uri Gnisi, the University of San Diego, UC San Diego, who's written this book, Mixed Signals, which is about how the messages that are sent by our, the incentives that we send out are not necessarily the ones that we intend. Really interesting read there. So we look forward to seeing you for that. Thanks again, Jeff. And thanks again, everybody. Have a good Friday night.
See everyone. Take care.